Hello guys and gals and welcome! So we're going to be going over another class today, and this time we're going to be going over the Barbarian. This character's actually named Barbarian. He's the Barbarian. The Barbarian is obviously one of the melee masters. He has some very interesting systems, including the expertise system, which allows him to have varying effects depending on what weapon he's actually using. So one-handed axes actually have increased critical strike chance against injured enemies, which is basically about 35% or less HP. One-handed mace expertise gives stuns. One-handed sword expertise gives lucky hit chance increases. Two-handed axe expertise gives increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Polearm expertise gives you bonus lucky hit chance. Two-handed sword expertise increases the amount of bleed damage. And finally, the two-handed mace expertise is chance to activate lucky hit increased by 1%. It's actually pretty darn interesting, like the different effects that you can potentially get. And from what I understand, when you finally activate your ability, it allows you to choose one of these to use with another weapon. So like say you're using the one-handed mace, but you'd really like the two-handed sword expertise along with it. Well, you can do that. You can choose the two-handed sword expertise and then use the maces. That's actually pretty interesting. But we don't have access to that yet because, of course, we are still locked in the beta with a maximum level of 25 and the server slam with a maximum level of 20. Now, I've played around with pretty much all these abilities. I've built a Bleed Barbarian, a Whirlwind Barbarian. I did a Frenzy Double Swing Barbarian. I did all sorts of interesting things. Played around with a lot of the abilities. Now, they have rebalanced some of it, but today we'll go over these and let's talk about the character and the abilities that he has. Flay is your bleed attack. It's actually a pretty good bleed attack, and you can stack it and you can make it do vulnerable damage. You can also add in more bleed damage, so when Flay deals direct damage to an enemy, 3% damage reduction, or you can go with the Flay deals direct damage to an enemy, 10% increased bleeding damage from you for the next 3 seconds. Basically, this is a bleed ability, and if you're going to be a bleed Barian, like my bleed Barian, bleed Barbarian, then this is probably the skill you want to go with. Frenzy is a nice little speed attack, and it does have to spool up a little bit, so it's a little slow at first. But once it gets going, it actually hits pretty darn quick. And I did have a lot of fun playing with Frenzy. I'm not exactly 100% sure if Frenzy is the skill I'm going to choose if I do make a Barbarian, but it is interesting. You can also enhance it to, while Frenzy is granting a 60% bonus to attack speed, it also generates 2 additional Fury, so you generate more Fury. Combat Frenzy, you can gain 8% damage reduction for each stack of Frenzy you currently have, or you can go the other way and you can go while berserking, your other skills gain 5% increased attack speed. So, like, you can basically set it up as a defensive ability, so you get damage reduction, or you can set it up as an offensive ability. Bash is straight from Diablo 2, and obviously you can bash the enemy multiple times. When you bash the enemy 4 times, you get a stun for 1.25 seconds, and that's nice. So you can also enhance the bash by giving it extra damage versus a stunned enemy. You can also have it, after it critically strikes 4 times, bash using the two-handed weapon your next core weapon mastery skill will overpower. And then damaging a stunned enemy with bash generates an additional 3 Fury or 4 Fury if you're using a two-handed weapon. So a lot of this stuff actually is pretty cool in terms of how the damage effects actually work. Bash in particular just seems like the good old-fashioned smack him in the face. And it definitely seems to have a preference for two-handed weapons. So you could be using, say, like a two-handed mace, for instance. And then we have Lunging Strike, which Lunging Strike lunges forward and strikes an enemy. So this is almost like a movement ability as well as a damage attack. You can enhance Lunging Strike to increase the damage and heal you for a little bit of life, which is definitely very nice. And then on top of that, we also have Combat Lunging Strike, which critical strikes with Lunging Strike get you berserking. And then you also have Battle Lunging Strike, which inflicts bleeding damage. Moving on to the core skills, let's start off with one of my favorites, which is Rend. Rend is a frontal AoE cone, and it causes all monsters in front of you to bleed. And if you want some practical, like knowledge of how it works, I definitely have a video up on my Bleed variant, so You can always take a look at that. But basically, it hits everything in front of you and applies a bleed. When you enhance it, it dealing direct damage with Rend extends the duration of vulnerable enemies by 2 seconds. We also have the Violent Rend, which increases the damage to vulnerable enemies. Or you can do the direct damage with Rend, grants 4 Fury per enemy hit. Now, I was partial to the Furious Rend because it allowed me to spam it more. And being able to spam it more meant I could stack more bleeds on the targets, which was nice. It actually works surprisingly well because you pretty much just kind of focus all your monsters, gather them up, and you use the ability and you can hit pretty much everything in front of you in a nice little cone and cause bleeding damage on all of them, which eventually ends in their death. Now, Whirlwind is a channel ability, and they had originally set it up where you could almost like permanently use it. But recently they've made some changes to the fury cost per second and other things so that it's not quite as easy to use forever. But they also up the damage a bit as well. So it does more damage now, but you don't really use it all the time. However, there are some ways that you can make Fury regenerate more Fury. Whirlwind regenerate more Fury. As you can see, Enhanced Whirlwind gain 1 Fury each time Whirlwind deals direct damage to an enemy, or 4 Fury against elite enemies. Furious Whirlwind, while using a slashing weapon, Whirlwind also inflicts bleed damage, so you can use Whirlwind as a bleeding type damage if you would like to. I made the mistake, though, of thinking that Whirlwind does a bleed, but it doesn't actually do a bleed unless you're using a two-handed slashing, or a slashing weapon specifically. So you have to go into the skill panel and actually choose which weapon you want to use. And I guess this is a good time to bring up the skill panel. So when you're looking at particular skills, you can actually choose which weapons the ability is going to use. So like, for instance, these tell you they're dual wield, so they're going to be using your dual wielded weapons. However, if you look at some of the other abilities, they will tell you that they are specifically for other things. Like, for instance, if I, let me just pull 1 point out here, put point into Whirlwind, so we can take a look at Whirlwind. And you'll notice that Whirlwind has a arsenal selection. Let's see here. Let's put this down here. I can never remember how to actually access the arsenal selection. I think it's... yeah, there it is. So as you can see, it's auto-select chooses the two-handed weapon, whereas I can go with dual wield, I can go with bludgeoning, or I can go with slicing. So if I wanted to get that bleed damage, I would have to go with the slicing weapon for Whirlwind. Otherwise, I would be using like a bludgeoning weapon by default, is what it seems to choose almost every single time. Some don't have choices, obviously. So other skills, like for instance the two-handed skills, require 2 weapons. So it requires a dual-wielded weapon. Whereas some abilities allow you to specifically choose which weapon you're going to use. Violent Whirlwind, also after using Whirlwind after 2 seconds, Whirlwind deals 30% increased damage until it's cancelled. We also have Hammer of the Ancients. Slam your hammer down with the Fury of the Ancients, dealing 176 to 215, 50% damage to a concentrated area. The Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients gains 3% more Fury for 5 seconds for each enemy damaged by the Hammer of the Ancients. So this is basically where you want to try and get as many monsters, like in the range of the ability as you can, because obviously the more monsters that are hit, the more Fury that you generate. So you gain 3% more Fury for 5 seconds for each enemy, which stacking up to 10 times, which is a total of 30% more, if you can manage to hit 10 monsters with the same attack. Furious Hammer of the Ancients. Hammer of the Ancients deals 1% additional damage for each point of Fury you had when using it. And then you can also do Violent Hammer of the Ancients. After overpowering with Hammer of the Ancients, you deal 30% more damage for 5 seconds. We also have a passive here, Pressure Point. Your core skills have up to a 10% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds, which vulnerable is, of course, additional damage. We also have Upheaval. Tear into the ground with your weapon. Fling debris toward the enemy. Enhanced Upheaval has a 20% chance to stun all enemies it damages for 2.5 seconds. We also have Violent Upheaval. If Upheaval damages at least 2 enemies, you gain Berserking for 2 seconds, increased for 3 seconds if it damages at least 4 enemies. You can also go with Furious Upheaval. Dealing direct damage to an enemy with a skill that is not Upheaval causes your next cast of Upheaval to deal 3 times increased damage, stacking up to 10. As you notice, a lot of these AoE abilities, they reward you for hitting multiple monsters. The more monsters you hit, the more damage it does, or the more effect it gives you. And it just seems to be like, in general, they want you to, you know, like have a little bit of a game of like, how many monsters can I hit with this particular ability. Double swing is the one that I've been using most recently, and this is a weapon sweep in front of you using two weapons like this. So it's basically like two weapons swinging in opposite directions, and it's interesting. If double swing damages a stunned or knockdown enemy, you gain 25 fury. Enhanced, that's the enhanced double swing. And then on top of that, we also have the casting double swing while berserking grants 2 additional seconds of berserking, which I've been using to enhance my berserking. And then we also have hitting an enemy with both hits of double swing makes them vulnerable for 1 second. Endless Fury. Basic skills generate 5% more fury when using two-handed weapons, so this would be something you would choose specifically if you were going to be a two-handed barb. And then moving on to the defensive skills, which it's important to note that the defensive skills actually shares plus to skills with all other defensive skills of other classes. So any skill, any class that has a category like this that specifically says defensive skills, like for instance if you found an amulet that had +1 to defensive skills, would work on any class that has defensive skills, which is pretty cool. So right off the bat we have the ground stomp, which is smash the ground, damaging and stunning surrounding enemies for 3 seconds. Pretty straightforward. Increases ground stomp duration by 1 second is the enhancement. And you can also choose between strategic ground stomp, reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 1 second for each enemy damaged by ground stomp. Again, very similar to what we were talking about earlier. The more monsters you hit, the better the effect, right? So they want you to hit more monsters. We also have ground stomp generates 25 fury, so you can utilize it to generate yourself some additional fury. We got 2 passives here, gain maximum life, and then we also have damage reduction against elites. These are 2 things that are supposed to make you tankier. Rallying Cry is increasing your movement speed by 30% and resource generation for 40% by 6 seconds, and nearby allies for 3. We also have an enhancement, which grants you the unstoppable ability, which means you can't be crowd controlled. And also you could potentially use that to break out of a crowd control as well, because unstoppable will remove any crowd control effects that are currently on you. Tactical Rallying Cry generates 20 fury and grants you an additional 20% resource generation. And then Strategic Rallying Cry grants you 10% base life as Fortify while Rallying Cry is active. You gain an additional 2% base life as Fortify each time you take or deal direct damage. So turns it kind of into a defensive mechanic. Iron Skin is one of the main abilities for defense on the Barbarian, I found. Because you steal yourself, gaining a barrier that absorbs 50% of your missing life for 5 seconds. Barrier absorption goes up with level, and of course you can also enhance it, so you can do things like Iron Skin's barrier absorbs 10% more of your maximum life. Iron Skin also grants 15% base life as Fortify, double this amount if cast while below 50% life. And also, while Iron Skin is active, heal for 10% of the barrier's original amount of life per second. There's 2 more passives here for the Thorns. Gain 13 Thorns, also gain 6 Thorns for each 32 maximum bonus life you have. And then, of course, you can also do Tough as Nails, increases your Thorns by 3% when enemies hit you. They take additional 10% of your Thorns as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Now, the Thorns actually recently got quite a hefty nerf, but I hear it's still halfway decent. Challenging Shout is a taunt that taunts nearby enemies, and when you taunt them, they have their damage reduced by 40%. It's interesting, especially since taunts can definitely be tactical within group settings. The enhancement to it is while Challenging Shout is active, you gain 20% bonus maximum life. You can also choose between while Challenging Shout is active, you gain 3 fury each time you take damage. And also Strategic Challenging Shout. While Challenging Shout is active, you gain Thorns equal to 30% of your maximum life. And I was just about to say, the Challenging Shout sounds an awful lot like it would be great with Thorns, and then bam, we have a Thorns option. Moving on to the Brawling skills, we have some passives to start out with: increased movement speed and decrease in control and parrying effects. Both of these seem like they would be pretty good in PvP. We also have Kick, which is throw a powerful kick, damage and knocks back enemies in front of you. Enemies who are knocked back into terrain take an additional damage and are stunned for 3 seconds. So you can knock a monster back into a wall or like a tree or something like it, and it causes additional damage. Enhanced Kick, damaging enemies with Kick makes them vulnerable for 4 seconds, which of course is going to get you more damage output. And if Kick damages an enemy, it consumes all of your fury and deals an additional 56 to 68 damage. Per 10 fury spent, Kick no longer knocks back enemies. So this takes it from a knockback and turns it more into an ability to use. Although it sounds like burning all your fury could potentially mean, well, you'd need to have some pretty nice fury generators. Mighty Kick, kicked enemies deal 152 to 186, 54% damage to enemies they collide with while being knocked back. Enemies damaged this way are knocked down for 2 seconds. That's a very nice way to get a knockdown. Warcry is an interesting one that will increase your damage dealt for 6 seconds and nearby allies for 3. You can also upgrade it so it gives you some berserking for 4 seconds, and then on top of that you can have it grant you 15% base life as Fortify. Or, if at least 6 enemies are nearby, when you cast Warcry, your damage bonus will be increased by an additional 10%. 3 more passives. We have the Booming Voice, which is the duration of shouts. The Raid Leader, which is your shouts also heal allies for 1% of their maximum life. And then we also have the Shout skills cause enemies to deal 4% less damage for 5 seconds. So a lot of very good ways that you can enhance the shouts to do more. And of course, I'm sure these work with the other shouts as well, like Rallying Cry and Challenging Shout. There's definitely quite a few shouts on the Barbarian. We also have Charge, become unstoppable and rush forward, pushing enemies with you when you then swinging through them for 25% damage and knocking them back. The enhancement to this will mean that enemies that are knocked back into terrain by Charge will take damage and will be stunned for 3 seconds. You can also choose between reduces Charge cooldown by 3 seconds if it knocks enemies back into terrain, which would kind of mean that you'd want to aim it at them at terrain. And Mighty Charge, which is damaging enemies with Charge, makes them vulnerable for 2 seconds. We also have Leap, which is a pretty standard, very nice little movement speed kind of a thing. You can leap over obstacles, down pathways, and things like that. It's pretty cool. Almost a one-point wonder in some ways, unless you want to actually use it for damage output. If Leap doesn't damage any enemies, its cooldown is reduced by 4 seconds, further making it a very good movement ability. If Leap damages at least one enemy, gain 40 fury. Enemies damaged by Leap are slowed by 50% for 5 seconds. And then we have 3 more passives here. Aggressive Resistance, gain 3% damage reduction while berserking. So this one's specifically for berserking. When Brawling, skill damages at least one enemy, gain berserking for 1 second. Another way to add berserking. And then while berserking, fury regeneration is increased by 6%. So a nice bonus to have while berserking. So if you're going to go with a berserk build, these seem like some pretty good options. Which brings us to the weapon mastery skills, and we end up with some more passives. So we got Pit Fighter, you deal 3% increased damage to close enemies and gain 2% distant damage reduction, so very nice for a melee fighter. No Mercy, you have 3% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies, which would be good if you are building it for that kind of effects. Expose Vulnerability, dealing direct damage with a weapon mastery skill causes your next curl skill to make enemies vulnerable for 1 second. And of course you can bring that up 3 times, so 3 seconds total. Slaying Strike, you deal 8% increased damage against injured enemies. Injured enemies are those below 35% life. Then we have Rupture. Rupture is a sort of a finisher, and the point of Rupture is to cause all of your bleeding damage to solidify. So let's say you're doing like 1,000 damage over 10 seconds, and the monster will eventually die in 10 seconds. But if you use Rupture, it's going to be a 1,100 damage, and it will deal that bleeding damage instantaneously. So basically, it just takes all of your bleed damage, removes it, and then applies it as a solid form of damage, which can be pretty darn ouchy depending on how many bleeds you currently have running on that target at that particular time. Enhanced Rupture, ripping out your weapon during Rupture causes an explosion that deals extra bleeding damage over 5 seconds. We also have Warrior Rupture, which hitting enemies with Rupture increases your attack speed by 20% for 4 seconds. And then finally, hitting at least one enemy with Rupture heals you for 15% of your maximum life. It's been my experience, though, with Rupture that you really need to actually have all the bleeds built to make it useful. So it tends to be kind of the last thing you build on your Bleed Barbarian, because you want to get all of your bleeds in place first. And speaking of bleeds, we have the bleed passive. So your bleeding effects slow enemies by 10%, which can go up to 30. And cut to the bone, your bleeding effects deal 6% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which of course can be beefed up 3 times for a total of 6, 12, what is that, 18% increased damage against vulnerable enemies for bleeds. We also have Steel Grasp, which is throw out a trio of chains that deals 64 to 79 damage and pulls enemies in, which can be useful, of course, if you're trying to hit as many enemies as possible. Like, for instance, with Whirlwind earlier, we were talking about how Whirlwind had a fury generation, for the number of enemies hit. Well, if you hit enough enemies, you can potentially sustain the Whirlwind for longer. So sucking all the enemies in so that you can hit them all together really quickly could potentially mean you could channel Whirlwind for a longer period of time. And there's other ways, or other reasons why you might want to pull in the monsters. Steel Grasp also makes enemies vulnerable, so you get an extra little damage bonus there. And if Steel Grasp damages an enemy, gain Berserking for 2 seconds. And then you could also go with the opposite, which is Steel Grasp gains 1 additional charge. And then we have the second set of passives here, which is Thick Skin. Each time you take direct damage, you gain base life as Fortify. Defensive Stance increases the damage reduction gained while you are fortified by an additional 2%. Counter Offensive, while you have Fortify over 50%, your maximum life, you deal 4% increased damage. So a lot of Fortify options here. And then finally on this tree we have Death Blow. So attempt a killing strike, dealing a huge amount of damage, 120% damage to enemies in front of you. If this kills an enemy, its cooldown is reset. Death Blow deals 100% increased damage to bosses. If Death Blow damages at least one enemy, gain 20 Fury. And you could also choose, if Death Blow damages at least one enemy, gain Berserking for 3 seconds. So a lot of good options there. And that brings us into the ultimates. And in the ultimate tree, we have quite a few different passives that seem to be very specifically related to what you're looking at weapon-wise. So like we have the heavy-handed, which is 2-handed weapons, deal increased critical strike damage. Your overpowered deal 15% increased damage when using 2-handed weapons. Your skills using bludgeoning weapons deal 5% increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. Concussion skills using bludgeoning weapons have up to a 10% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds, or up to a 15% chance when using 2-handed bludgeoning weapons. So definitely some customizability there. Some of the other passives are things like Duelist. Attack speed is increased by 3% while using 1-handed weapons. And then we also have the increased maximum fury. Each time you swap weapons, gain 2 fury, and the heal for 3% of your maximum life for each 100 fury spent. Now, the actual ultimates, Call of the Ancient, actually summons down Corlic, Talik, and Madoc from Diablo 2 in the Ancients challenge, and they pretty much do the same exact things. Corlic leaps, Talik spins with Whirlwind, and Madoc, he doesn't have throwing items, so instead they gave him Upheaval, which is interesting. You can beef up the Ancients by gaining a 10% bonus to attack speed and increased damage while it is active. And then you can also do each of the Ancients gains additional power. Corlic, you gain 10 Fury each time Corlic damages an enemy with his Frenzy. Talik, enemies are slowed by 50% for 1 second when damaged by his Whirlwind. And Madoc, 30% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds when using Upheaval. This is one that I used extensively, Iron Maelstrom, which is pretty darn cool. And basically what it does is it activates 3 times, and basically you attach chains to each one of your weapons and perform some big attacks. The first one is your 2-handed bludgeoning weapon, which slams into the ground, dealing 60% damage and stunning enemies for 2 seconds. Next, you use your 2-handed slashing weapon and swipes in front of you, dealing a 20% damage and inflicting a huge 120% bleed over 5 seconds. Finally, your dual-wielded weapons swing around you, dealing 33% damage per hit. This one was really nice because as a bleed barbarian, it gave me a very easy way to apply a huge bleed to everything around me in a circle, which I really enjoyed. Iron Maelstrom gains 10% increased critical strike chance and 20% increased critical strike damage. And then you can also choose Supreme Iron Maelstrom, which is dealing direct damage to an enemy after swapping weapons, reduces Iron Maelstrom cooldown by 1 second. Finally, we have Wrath of the Berserker, which is explode into a rage, knocking back surrounding enemies and gaining Berserking and Unstoppable for 5 seconds. Of course, Berserking is the increase in your damage and your movement speed, and Unstoppable, of course, prevents all controlled comparing effects. For the next 10 seconds, dealing direct damage with basic skills grants berserking for 5 seconds. So basically, you can enhance your berserking to a total of, what is that, 10 seconds total, so 5 initially. And you can get direct damage is 5 seconds for every attack, so I'm not really sure exactly how long you could potentially get that to. While Wrath of Berserker is active, gain 20% increased movement speed and increase Fury regeneration by 30%. And while Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increases Berserk's damage bonus by 25%. Then we're taken over to the Capstones. So the Capstones are special abilities that affect like how you build a particular character. Like my Bleed Barbarian probably would have wanted Gushing Wounds, which is when causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance to equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 100% of your critical strike damage bonus. Overpowering a bleeding enemy and creates an explosion that inflicts 34% bleeding damage over 5 seconds. We also have the Unbridled Rage, which is core skills deal 135% increased damage, but cost 100% more fury, which could be very interesting if you have a build which is very, very focused on massive amounts of fury regeneration. We also have Walking Arsenal, dealing direct damage with two-handed bludgeoning weapons or two-handed slashing weapons, or dual-wielding weapons, grants 10% increased damage for 6 seconds. While all 3 damage bonuses are active, you gain an additional 15% increased damage. So this is literally one of those abilities that's for someone who wants to use pretty much every weapon in your arsenal. And then finally, we have Unconstrained, which is pretty much for Berserk. So increases Berserk's maximum duration by 5 seconds and increases its damage bonus by 25%. So for those barbarians who want to set up a berserking build. Honestly, all in all, the Barbarian is very interesting, and there are a lot of fun ways that you can potentially set the Barbarian up. Everything from Thorns builds to Bleed builds to physical damage builds, Whirlwind builds. You can even go with builds that stun and knock down monsters. It seems like there's really no limit to the combination of effects that you could potentially do. I've also had a couple of people in the kinship who are trying to build Shout Barbarians or Cry Barbarians, which is rather interesting. Overall, I'm not the biggest Barbarian fan. And even I have to admit that the Barbarian in Diablo 4 is very impressive. And I was actually pleasantly surprised with the way the Barbarian worked in Diablo 4. I think that's pretty much it, though, for this class. And I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos. And as always, keep watching.